majority, big mouth.
Well, one lady that's been kicked out of the sisterhood, was kicked out years ago, is New South Wales Liberal Senator Fierravanti-Wells. She joins us each Thursday on the program. Connie, good morning.
Good morning, Stephen.
It was just extraordinary, wasn't it? I mean, now, whether you're a fan of Scott Morrison or not, and I don't know Jenny Morrison particularly well, but there was just nothing in that photo.
No, look, it's society's gone mad, quite frankly, on a whole range of different fronts, and I think that reflects more on the person who was making the comment rather than the Prime Minister's wife.
Indeed. Now, one of the policy areas that you've always been passionate about, and even before you went into Parliament, was the aged care sector. 12 leading aged care consumer organisations have released a joint response to the Aged Care Royal Commission. The government has effectively agreed or acknowledged most of the recommendations, but the one that they've shirked at is the introduction of a Medicare-style levy to fund aged care. What's your view on that?
Look, Stephen, there has to be some serious work undertaken in relation to the adequacy of funding of the aged care sector. And there's no doubt that the government, of course, is going to give its main response in the budget. It will provide a full report on all the recommendations by the 31st of May, which was the request of the Royal Commission. Look, Stephen, there are two key areas that really do need serious consideration. And these are the two areas, and whilst the commissioners differed in the way that could be done, nevertheless they do agree that there needs to be, firstly, a thorough redesign of the system with new governance arrangements, and secondly, a new aged care levy that has to deal with the inadequacy of funding. Now, of course, they differ on the institutional form of those two areas, but nevertheless they do agree. And therefore, we really have to now look at, do we go to an independent commission model, which was one of the Commissioner Pagoni, or do we go for more of the same with more regulation and changes at the edges, as was recommended by Commissioner Briggs? So whichever way it goes, Stephen, we're going to have to consider those two very key areas, and we have to consider them substantially.
One of the things that a lot of people are calling for, and it seems to be the cry du jour these days, is we want immediate action, and very rarely do people actually tell you what that action that they demand is. But this is such a complex issue that the government is quite right not to rush into any solutions, I would imagine.
Well, it's not only a situation which requires careful consideration, but let's not forget, Stephen, the Royal Commission was undertaken against the background of over 20 major reports and inquiries in recent decades. And also, we are in a phase of transition between effectively the parents of the baby boomers and the baby boomers who are going to be a lot more demanding than their parents were, and they're also financially more able to demand greater choice. And so when you do have such a generational impact, it does require serious consideration for change. But above everything else, I think more of the same is not going to deliver the change that we need. And let's not forget here that the commissioners were both on the same page, particularly in relation to shifting to a needs-based system with a universal entitlement to aged care. Now, to achieve that, you have to reconfigure the system. And if you're going to reconfigure the system to one of entitlement that deliberately mirrors Medicare entitlements, which is what they are talking about, and you're going to impose on the aged care sector what they've referred to as a non-delegable statutory duty on approved aged care providers to ensure that the nursing and the personal care that residents get is of safe and high quality, you are looking at a major overhaul. And Stephen, as I said, you're not going to achieve major overhaul if there isn't, if you're going to stick to more of the same. And that really is, as I talk to stakeholders in this space, and I've certainly continued my engagement in this space, people are talking about the need for major change. And when you look at the systemic problems in the aged care sector, the Australian government, as the Commissioner said, have been the dominant funder of aged care services, but it has not funded the system adequately, and that's really where it comes down to.
Well, that's right, and they've already announced an additional $452 million in funding, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you look at the scale of the issue that we need to deal with here, clearly not enough. But some of the recommendations that these 12 providers have called for, or 12 consumer organisations, minimum staffing levels, wage increases for workers, stronger powers for an independent regulator, and transparency from providers. I mean, all of these things seem like fairly common sense approaches, but all of those things are going to cost significant amounts of money.
Well, they are, and I think that the minimum staffing requirements, the workforce changes are really vital, because you cannot provide a high-quality care if you don't have adequate nursing and other staff that are going to provide those services. So this is not something that you tinker in one area or another area. This is a major overhaul of the system, and that's why I certainly, in my 52-page submission to the Royal Commission, basically looked at the system right across its diversity and came up with what I believe is a blueprint. And I think I've said this before, and I was very, very pleased that the Royal Commission picked up on many of the sensible suggestions that I made in my submission, which really go to tackling not only what is necessary, but the how. And look, let's step back, and it was in the initial comments that you made. This is not just about the nature of the reform, but it's also how you do it. And it has to be reform that is undertaken right across the sector. So to do that, you need reform over a period of time, which is why my suggestion of an agreement effectively, and we've seen agreements in other areas. We've got it in the pharmacy sector. We've got a history of agreements between the government, the unions, the industry groups. That's what you're going to need, Stephen. You're going to need everybody on the same page, all part of the process to achieve the reform that's going to be necessary. And I'm very pleased to see, I spoke about a 5-year agreement between the government and the various components of the sector, and I'm very pleased to see that the Royal Commission itself spoke about a 5-year reform task.
Are you confident that the government will be able to manage this and that we will see adequate reform?
Well, Stephen, as I said, unless the process is a consensus-based process, which is depoliticised and which depoliticises the process of reform, which we've seen in other areas like the pharmacy agreement, we need certainty and we need flexibility, and we need the whole gamut of care to be considered as part of that reform. And that's everything from well-being right through to palliative care. Every aspect of care needs to be considered as part of this process. And Stephen, one of the things that has characterised discussion in this sector is that both sides have shied away from reform for fear of criticism. And regrettably, it's been very easy to scare our older Australians. And so that's why, if you're going to achieve real reform, you really do have to ensure that the process is one that straddles different governments. It has to have realistic timeframes, but it also has to be, as I said, a process where everybody that needs to be part of this journey is part of the journey. It cannot be imposed. And so I go back to the original point that I made, Stephen. You have to work out, are you going to tinker with the system as it is with more of the same, or are you actually going to look at a new model of care? And it seems to me that unless you are prepared, and certainly this is the feedback that I'm getting as I speak to